everybody. Joe Moore here, joined by Livi Joy. How are you today?
I'm good. Thanks, Joe.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you on. You're quite deep in the Bay Area scene, involved in the Sacred Garden community and the Existential and Palliative ministry. Before we dig in, I kind of want to say, like, what happened to get psychedelics on your radar? How did these plants or substances come on your radar in a meaningful way? It's not like, oh, like acid was interesting once and then it came.
No,
However you want to talk about it.
yeah, no, and like, I kind of follow this trend that I see a lot, like kind of like a lot. I mean, I do a lot of screenings. I screen for two organizations. I'm deep with Sacred Garden community, but I also screen for Beckley Retreats. And so I talk to a lot of people about their experience and kind of follow this arc of, I had some recreational experiences, a lot of recreational experiences in my late teens and early 20s. Some of those really were really super profound. And then, I took a step back. For me, it was because my Reiki master was really like, you got to choose one or the other. What are you doing here? And so I took a pretty big break from psychedelics. But also because I had a really big LSD experience, a really big LSD experience in my early 20s that really did take years to integrate and probably was like most integrated by a 5-MeO experience that was also really big. But really, helped me integrate that experience. And then it wasn't for like until my early 40s, so like 10 years ago, no, like late 30s, 10 years ago, a while ago, that psychedelics came back into my life, and like I tried to do them recreationally again, and like it was like no, like there's work for you here, and really deep inner work, and both can happen at the same time, right? That was a big learning.
So it's kind of like that material was emerging in the recreational spaces, and you're like, oh, this isn't the right time to be
set and
doing this.
setting, like, okay, I'm gonna make the best of it because here's, I think one of my most favorite stories of like my coming to a space of doing it way more intentionally was being at a concert Ween was playing and discovering guitar-gasms existed. And I really had the felt sense that as much as I could lean into the joy and the bliss of being embodied and having this synesthesia experience with the music, meant the deeper my psyche could travel into these really deep, dark places, and examine like my first, instances with toxic masculinity, how I wasn't protected for that as a girl emerging into womanhood, really like deep stuff. Like while like on the surface, it looked like I was just having a great time dancing, and like learning how to hold myself. And what's also true is that in my early 20s, I was part of a women's spirituality community and was learning a lot of priestessing skills and starting to hold a lot of workshops around conscious menstruation of all things. And there's a lot of like trauma and really deep, heavy stuff, that would come up in those workshops, and I needed to skill up. And so I decided to go back to school for a master's in clinical counseling. And so I got into that world, was kind of sucked into the clinical world for a while, at the same time while actually beefing up all these skills around holding ceremony and container and learning from like cross-culturally like amazing women from all different lineages. So then years later, when I was coming into my own, like, wow, like these experiences are bringing me to some like heavy, like, and awesome places that therapy just hadn't in itself never had. Folks knew that I was doing that work, and my housemate actually knew of somebody who wanted to do a journey themselves, had worked with some other sitters, didn't feel comfortable with the content that they wanted to work with the previous folks. And she thought that I would be a really appropriate person. And so she pitched it to me like, hey, you have all this experience. what would you think about sitting for this person? And I was really super fortunate. I knew a couple of folks in the community who were already doing that work. And two people were super generous with their time and like having conversations with me about how to keep myself safe, what kind of questions to ask them. And so that was I started being an underground facilitator. And by that point in time, I had left the clinical counseling world because, as we were talking about a little bit before the show, the pathology paradigm was something that I was increasingly frustrated with, that somebody needed a diagnosis in order to get any kind of like help or to achieve like what they think is their state of health and wellness. Like it's measured against some DSM standards that they may or may not live up to, be able to check all the boxes to get the help they need. And so I was doing different forms of helping people like EFT that were outside the licensure world. And so like stepping into the like underground facilitator world was kind of my next step. And then I really missed peer supervision. I missed like having other people to talk about things with. And being kind of accountable and having, and the issues of like, yeah, like if I do something wrong, who can somebody complain to? Like how can I be held accountable? And so in that kind of desire to be part of like a collective or something, as well as because I was interested in facilitating groups and I thought like I needed a little bit more like training on that. I found Sacred Garden Community and started hanging out with them and went through their facilitator training, a facilitator intensive workshop with the intention of becoming ordained, which I did.
That's beautiful. What were you living in the Bay at the point when Sacred Garden came across your radar?
Yeah, and actually I met Bob for the first time at Bioneers as a result of a Chacruna panel. Like Chacruna actually was doing a panel there, and he was hanging out with them. He brought all their plants, and I was really in deep in the throes of doing my own ancestor work, if you will, and really like okay, like my grandfather was a mushroom dude. I have no idea if he and his hunting buddies ever like had other mushrooms when they went on their hunting trips, but he was a first generation Polish and really like had a lot of deep knowledge of foraging like culinary mushrooms. And so it was like how to like talk to my DNA lineage of like what kind of work they were doing, what kind of knowledge was lost, and like translating the idea of a dieta to like doing my ancestor work. And then, so like I was talking to anybody and everybody who I'm like, oh, wow. And somebody was like, you should go talk to this guy Bob. He's sitting over at the Tricuna table. Side note, I ended up doing a Nettle dieta for that journey. Because at one point in time when I was traveling in Eastern Europe, I was in like the mountains in Slovakia and had a dream about grandmothers teaching me how to harvest nettle without getting stung. And somebody was like, yes, like, what are you, of course, do that. And so, yeah, I did a nettle dieta before a psilocybin journey.
That's an interesting one. What are the characteristics of nettle? I'm not too familiar with that in this kind of more shamanic context.
So none that I know of, right? What I know of nettle is that, I mean, it's been used, it's kind of almost like hemp and cannabis in that it is like a multi-use plant, right? You can use the stalks for rope and for making all, like fiber, like fabric even. The leaves though, you can they're edible. You need to like blanch them to not get like because of the little pricklies on them. And the particular kind of, I think it's an oil that will give you the rash when you touch the little like hairs on the leaves. But it's super high in chlorophyll and in iron, and so they're really nutritious. Like you could practically survive on like nettle as like foraging for a few days if you needed to. Yeah.
That's interesting. Huh. Well, Bioneers is awesome. I was going to Bioneers. I think I started giving psychedelic talks at a Bioneers in 2007, maybe. It was super interesting. And really just great to be connected with such an interesting group. I guess for those who don't know, it's kind of like an ecological, very hopeful movement, bringing in really interesting talent. Like, for instance, when Paul Stamets wasn't as famous, he would give some really interesting talks there. Yeah.
Michael Pollan first debuted.
Anything? Yeah, like Michael Pollan did that.
Yeah.
Interesting. Cool. So let's dig in. Like, what made you want to get involved in Sacred Garden community? Like, did you just have a great time, or what was it about the community there?
So I met Bob, and like we started going to the Sunday gardens, and things were way more informal at that point with Sacred Garden. And then kind of got busy with some other things, and I was like, oh, okay, if you guys are having another facilitator intensive in a little bit. And that was like in, I think, late 2018 that I first met him. And he's like, yeah, we're planning on having one next year, da 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 da. Cool, cool. And then I didn't really like hear about anything going on. And then one of the friends who I said was a mentor to me we were trying to do co-facilitate some group work. And he said, hey, have you heard about these folks, Sacred Garden community? And I said, yeah, actually I have. And he's like, do you know that they're like writing the bylaws of a church right now? And I'm like, no, I did not know that. And he's like, yeah, they're having Zoom meetings. From what I understand, they're like open, and this is like right after decrim happened. So he gave me the Zoom link. I hopped on a Zoom, and very similar to the Sacred Garden Sunday services that continue every week at 11 a.m. Now. Those Thursday meetings for like getting the bylaws together morphed into these Sunday morning services. There's plant time, and like at every meeting, even though we were there to like hash out bylaws, Bob would like grab whatever in his garden was like growing, and it really was like I've never felt called to personally engage in the sacraments of the South, right? So like I was just like, oh, but that's what a chacruna plant looks like, right? Like that's like what an iodine looks like. And then like learning like, oh my gosh, like there's 5-MeO DMT like in plants that grow along the roadside, like all the like I was hooked with plant time, absolutely positively. And also like I like being a part of starting things. I have that kind of building energy in my persona, so it was really attractive to me to get in these meetings like where they're like hashing out bylaws. Like not everybody's into that kind of thing, and I'm like, oh no, I'm here for it. Like what do we like what word, right? Because our core tenet of faith is, and even hashing out the core tenet of faith, like what words are we going to use? We are open to the possibility through the careful engagement of our church's sacraments that you can have a direct experience of the divine in this lifetime. So like every one of those words and phrases were like labored over, like we can't use God, obviously, no, but not over, like, like how we settled on divine, how, we settled on using the word sacraments, which can be like really triggering to folks, and but we want to be like, no, like if you just look at the roots of the word sacrament, like it is true to what we're doing. And whatever churches who have used their power to dominate people for centuries have used that word and those practices, that's not what we're doing. Yeah, it was super exciting, super interesting to be a part of all that.
Beautiful. And yeah, it's super interesting to have that kind of path. It's like I'm here as now a founder, kind of. And that's really interesting. So what did it look like to get that facilitator training going for you? Like that process of you jumping into their framework?
Yeah, and so I love this because like right, Richardson was just on, and when he was asked, what is a good framework, he laid out these steps that I think at this point, like, a lot of people agree with. And when I got to Sacred Garden, they're like, oh, we already kind of have this, conceptual framework that we call the fractal wheel of practice. Um, and I looked at it, and at that time, it might have only been the wheel of practice. I'm not sure when it became the fractal wheel of practice, but we call it the fractal wheel of practice because within each of the steps are the steps, right? And so there's like macro and micro levels. And so those are navigation, preparation, initiation, practice, integration, and community integration, right? And when I looked at that, I was like, oh, that's already what I'm doing. I can map every step of like how I like have people come through the work that I do with them. I can map all of it with the exception of community integration, and that's why I'm here, right? And we do need what people sometimes refer to as sticky community, right? Because you can have these amazing circles, with sacrament, wachumo, ayahuasca, whatever. You have these people come together for this really super intense experience and share this camaraderie. And maybe some people stay together on a signal chat thread that they use to form a ride share beforehand, but like there's no like official container, there's no structure, there's no easy way to continue to keep in touch. And for folks who, and this is like, I love in Fantastic Fungi, Roland Griffiths like shares how much it broke his heart to see participants in the clinical trials have no one really in their life who understood their experience, right? That they were so isolated, like in their day-to-day life, because just like they had this experience that nobody could understand or relate to. And like, because of the pollen effect, right? The Michael Pollan books and stuff, you have a lot of people who, didn't grow up going to dead shows or, weren't like in like a culture that don't have like that access in their life to other people who are interested in these things. And so we have people coming to Sacred Garden community who are curious and interested. And it might be the only place in their life where they have other people to talk about their experiences with and to understand how to find an integration group and to have their experiences normalized, right? Like, because even within the medical trials, people are not going to talk about entities, right? People like there's some things that like they're just so like scared of, or they don't want to be perceived as like going crazy. And and there are places within our community to be like, oh, like, do you think that was part of God, that, or part of the divine, were those entities? Like, we can just have really thoughtful dialogue. And because of our least dogma, like, anybody can have their own idea or conception or cosmology or metaphysics, and nobody's going to tell them that they're wrong unless they're hurting somebody with that.
Right. I love that. So I'm really kind of curious about the EPM situation and what you have going there. Palliative care, obviously super important. Hospice care, incredibly important, like a real revolution in medicine. Like, I hate to have to, like, it's like the most obvious thing ever, but it's like, oh, look at this revolution. But, really, now that we're able to, in a lot of cases, deploy psychedelics and plant medicine in a religious framework, especially like ministry, chaplaincy, etc., like, there's some really interesting and good work that can be done here.
Totally. And so in some ways, Sacred Gardens EPM, the Existential Palliative Ministry, and we did decide to keep that word palliative in the title, even though it's kind of a mouthful, and because it is like what you're talking about in terms of the history of like care. The palliative movement is super important and aligned with what we're doing. But yeah, how that came about in SGC actually is almost entirely about the fact that Sunil Agarwal, who's suing the DEA around access to psilocybin for like under right to try laws, was like, this is way too slow. Like, I have people who are dying now this is obviously going to take years, perhaps, to go through the federal channels. How can I get my patients access to these experiences in the meantime? And somebody put the bug in his ear about RIFRA and the religious access, the religious path of access. And he met Bob and they got along really well. And they're as soon as the idea was floated in our kind of the people who are meeting all the time in community, and is this something that we should actually put resources towards? There was just an overwhelming yes. And I think part of it is because of what I think of as the grandma effect, which is it's one of the hardest. I mean, who's gonna tell an 89-year-old woman that it's dangerous for her to have a psilocybin experience, and that I'm gonna deny you that? And it's like veterans. It's one of the cases that people who look like the people in power can be like, no, we want this, right? Essentially old white people, right? And that it's really hard to argue with. The other part is that's where so much of the hype was from, the clinical trials and looking at how it actually can ameliorate demoralization, right? And so it's Sacred Garden loves science. If we get into talking about the pathology paradigm versus the medical model, I don't think any of us have, in Sacred Garden, we're totally down with the fact that there is a medical model, because that actually helps keep us safe. We want there to be more clinical trials, just around safety data. We want clinicians to be really upfront about what exclusionary criteria in their trials are because of keeping their data clean versus because it's an actual contraindication, and a danger with the substance that they're using in the trial, because we just need more of that information. And so, all of the palliative care and even hospice care trials, so much data, right? We are yay, thank you. Now we know how to try and keep people safe through this experience. On the other hand, I've noticed what I call the Aldous Huxley effect, which is people can get really almost zealot in the beginning of finding out about all of this, about yes, let's feed everybody a bunch of acid on their deathbed. And everybody who you'll talk to who is actually seasoned and a veteran in this space will agree that that is not a good idea, right? That that the further away from the death process itself, the sooner in somebody's journey that you can provide them access to this kind of experience, the better. Partially because death is a psychedelic experience in and of itself, and partially because the body load of the dying process is already so much that the additional body load of an additional psychedelic, once somebody's in palliative care, they're generally taking them off all medications other than whatever's just there to keep them comfortable. And so adding something that might make them nauseous or might, give them temperature dysregulation, that's not a great idea either, right? And so if we can provide people with the experiences and with the option for the experiences, as part of that, I don't know if you've ever gone through a big diagnosis, but so I am a cancer survivor, and it's one of the things, when you get a big diagnosis, you get to meet with a medical social worker, who talks about all the things that you might want to do, to get your affairs in order, advance directives, all these sorts of things. And could one of those things be oh, and here's a referral to have this experience, whenever you're ready for it. Hopefully it would be through a chaplain, ideally. And, yeah, but that folks should have access to these experiences well before they're actually in palliative care, but be part of leading into that.
Interesting. Cool. Yeah, I always find the Huxley LSD story fascinating, and how how light the LSD load is relative to like something like a San Pedro or mushroom. It's fascinating, worth thinking about. And perhaps IV psilocin would be fine too, or IM psilocin. Like, no need to go through the liver. It's straight up. You don't have to deal with the extra weird molecules. But yeah, I think there's also a really great point of getting to these people early. Like, can we get to them a year ahead of time, or right when they get the cancer diagnosis? I think that would be really interesting. No, not personally. I had a misdiagnosis. That was a big deal. They told me I was going to be in a wheelchair within a couple years due to body degeneration. Turns out I was just driving my meat suit a little too hard through space. But yeah, everything was fine there mostly. And family, though, a lot of family diagnoses where this would have been very helpful. And it's always interesting to me, like, how can we really like work towards developing what is the right relationship here for these things in culture.
Yeah. And so speaking of family, many folks have said, and I know that there's clinical trials now in terms of enrolling a family member or support person into the work with sacrament as well. In like one of the absolute like potential deal breakers in assessing whether somebody is an ideal candidate for our ministry, the Existential Palliative Ministry, is, do you have at least one support person, right? Because that was kind of a sidebar I went to the MAPS conference workshop in Denver last year, the kind of pre-workshop, the all day with the palliative care focus. And there's no like definitive research on like who this didn't work for. Like somebody asked, like, what about the 20% that didn't see the gains? Like, what happened there? Like, any ideas? And one doctor spoke that there's, like I said, no analyzed data, but that anecdotally it seemed to be that the gist was those people didn't, either there was somebody who was like antagonistic about their having this experience like within their zone one, or they just didn't have like any support, right? And so for a variety of reasons, like that's like an absolute requirement that if you want to go through the Sacred Garden Community Existential Palliative Ministry liturgy, we call them liturgies, that you have to have at least one support person, and that person will show up to at least one of the preparation calls, right? And going back to that fractal wheel, for that particular liturgy, for the EPM liturgy, there's at least 2 preparation meetings. And the way that we do it, and this is like a best practice thing, kind of like from what I learned as an underground facilitator and bringing in, and kind of like what other people too on the team have learned, and how we've also moved into our practicum and moving people through our practicum into ordination, is that it's not about the number of times you assist a ceremony. It's not about the number of preparation sessions that you have. It's about like there's a list of information, or there's a list of skills, and can you demonstrate those skills in the case of facilitator becoming an ordained, or in the case of the EPM, have you actually asked all these questions? Have you gotten all this information from this person? Have you covered all these topics? And for some people that might only take 2 meetings, one meeting with just them and one meeting with them and their support person or people. And for other people, it might take 2 or 3 meetings to get through all of that, depending on what their history is like.
Yeah, that's substantial, and I love that. What was some of the more impressive things you've seen on the tail end of EPM? Like, say you work somebody through the program.
So what is true is that we've only gotten one person all the way through. And what's true is that the most impressive thing that I've seen about it was, or like the most like impactful, and I think beautiful, instance was somebody who died in between our last preparation session and when they were meant to have their journey. And part of that was a few days after the preparation set, our like last preparation session before, well, our last remote preparation session. We were going to do one more in person. I was going to travel to where they were, and we were going to have a in-person check-in preparation the day before the actual liturgy. But like a couple of days after our last remote preparation session, which was like tracked, because in our last remote preparation session, like I could see she looked lower energy, and something had just like shifted.
Mm-hmm.
She actually came back and said, like, I am so sorry, but I don't think I have the energy to go through with this. And I said, yeah, no worries, no worries. And it was like within, I think, 48 hours after that email that she actually passed away. And I don't know, I can't say, but like what it felt like is that she didn't have a death doula. She had people like in her family who were really supportive. She had a great palliative care team, but she at that point hadn't really had anybody just sit down with her and like really talk to her about like the ways that she was feeling ready but was feeling guilty for leaving her daughters who were not yet grown yet. Like they're like, she'd not really had the opportunity to really think about like, oh, my bed right now is in a place where like I have to navigate stairs to get to, like, which is getting increasingly difficult, like, but I love the view up there, so I keep like muscling up there to get it. Like, oh, I can ask my family to just turn the dining room, whose windows also have that view, into like where my bed is for the rest of my time here. So, and that those conversations came up in preparation for our journey, because it's just like, oh, well, we can't navigate stairs like during the journey, like that's not a thing. So where else can we do it? And like, oh, this view in this dining room, like, well, can you just move your bed down there? Like that's, and so these kinds of like preparation questions, like for the journey, like coincided with preparation questions for what people would call like her vigil. If anybody's gone through death doula training, that's the language that death doulas use. And I have gone through a death doula training at this point as part of like skilling up for this work. For the time when somebody is really in the active dying phase, has transitioned into the active dying phase, and are like, in whatever way they want to, can receive loved ones and or be alone and just be tended to, once the active dying process has really begun. And so, there's a way in which I felt like all of our conversations like helped her conceive of what she wanted that to look like. And then it happened. And that was super powerful. It was like, I'm like, my eyes are getting all watery just thinking about it. Like, and like and I've had this conversation with people. I've done a guest presentation to another emerging church who has a bunch of people interested in doing this kind of work. And we got into the conversation like, is the sacrament even always necessary? Or is it just this, the presence that as facilitators who work with these sacraments, and they are so like tied into death. And like, I know we've had so many guests who have talked about this, that there's a way in which we hope that maybe psychedelics can help ameliorate our death phobic culture. There's also a way in which I wonder in which our culture is so afraid of psychedelics because we are death phobic, right? But there is a relationship there. And, so when somebody shows up who has really done their own work around that and can really sit and just be with that, the kinds of relief and like access to information and feelings that just holding that space could create, that's the most powerful thing, honestly. And that's both in my preparation conversations with other folks too. And so what's true, as I mentioned, so going way back to your question, only one person has actually moved all the way through the EPM liturgy. And part of that is because of our careful screening process and the way in which, I mean, one of them, it was like the her daughter was really the one who was like, gunning for it. Like she was the one who was like, I think this would really be helpful for my mom. Her mom was like, okay, I'm open to it. But then as it got closer to the time and we were going through more preparation sessions, she had a huge fall risk. And at the same time, her family really wanted to transition her into a continuing care community who would only accept people at the independent living stage. And then you could like stay all the way through to skilled nursing. But if she like fell again, she would mess up her chances of getting in independent living potentially and then like not be able to be in this. And it's just like, no, we don't want that for her, right? Like we don't want to do a journey at this point where if she falls accidentally during the journey, no, yeah, that doesn't sound like a good idea. Like get her resettled in there, and if it still feels like a good idea, come back to us. And so yeah, we just through careful screening and asking people like, are they really like, is this really a good idea? Yeah, especially like outside of, we wouldn't be in a clinical setting. We do the EPM liturgy is as written, done in somebody's home for a variety of reasons. And so, like we need to be extra careful.
Right. And that's a two-edged sword, but it's still one that we need to wrestle with. So I'm kind of curious about like, you mentioned the term, everybody can have an experience of the divine in this lifetime. Is that how you phrased it?
Yeah, our core tenet of faith, SGC's core tenet of faith.
Can you, like, how do you understand that? And then how do you understand how that relates to EPM as well? Because I assume there's some flow back and forth.
Oh, totally. And, so, okay, to answer that question, I'm going to give a little bit more context about SGC's kind of membership and practitionership setup. And so at SGC, we call folks who have gone through the onboarding process and the health and safety process, we call them practitioners, which is, I know, different and confusing because sometimes people call the people who are serving the sacrament practitioners only, right? But because of that, no priestly class, right? Like the reason that we have facilitators is to create a container and allow you to have your own experience, and actually you're in charge of your experience, and we want to respect everybody in that way. We call everybody practitioners, and you need to, in order to be a member and be eligible to be a practitioner, or in order to be a member who is eligible to be a practitioner at SGC, you need to hang out with us for at least 3 months and attend at least 8 events. Because we want, before you just sit in a ceremony with us, we want you to have a good sense of what that core tenet of faith is really about, like how other people, like you asked about mine, and I'll get there, but how does that live in the community? How does that show up? How does that, and if somebody wants to hang out for 3 months and attend 8 of our events that aren't sacrament related and say, yes, I'm here for it, they go through a confirmation, and we actually do call it confirmation. We have a ceremony where people attest to our core tenet of faith, and they attest to living up, or attempting to live up, trying to live up to our core community values of care, respect, and trust. And it's a whole beautiful thing, and it really helps people feel part of a community. Now with the EPM, because we realize that those folks don't have the luxury of time and resources to go through that process, we have developed, and we do have a guest protocol that we put people through, but we still really do want them to be able to affirm that core tenet of faith. And that's and part of the reason that it's the language is, I am open to the possibility. You would really have to be a buckled down, really strict materialist to not even be open to the possibility of the divine. And if you can't even say that, then maybe you're just seeking drugs, and that's not somebody who we want to work with anyway, right? yeah, like we actually, there is a conversation around like, no, like you want to have this meaningful experience as part of, and maybe you aren't sure, maybe you are an atheist and you are just honestly just like open to the possibility. You're like, I'm curious, I'm nearing death, I'm closer to death, I want to like understand what might be on the other side, or I might want to have a better understanding of, like, after a life of materialism, like I've heard about other people having these experiences, like what are mine? Or um and so my experience is, I mean, I I am somebody who does not necessarily require the sacraments of our church to have non-ordinary state experiences in which I get into that numinous state, of, you know, having like an experience of the divine. But I recognize that is not the case for everybody on this planet. And so I think my first like big deep experiences of what I would consider like divine, yeah, non-dual state, unity consciousness, were definitely as a result of I think that 5-MeO experience I referenced earlier was really the first big one of like, oh, in which I like, you know, shot straight into the void and experienced the thisness of everything, and the nothing in everything. And then later, through psilocybin, experienced a journey in which like the mantra and the theme was, what am I afraid to feel? And the answer to that question kept coming up as loneliness, right? And that is such a big part of the human experience. And in my conception, and like my cosmology and theology, you know, like humans are part of God's great experiment. In order to experience creation and experience God's creation, God needed to run an algorithm to separate off parts of consciousness that would then forget like by default, to forget that it was part of the original consciousness in order to have a unique experience of creation. And there's these ways that we can enter into these non-ordinary states that finds the back door in that algorithm, and like gets us back into what I call God's eyes, where we see ourselves and the world as part of that oneness, as opposed to like just our separate little individual, like, you know, a bot or program or app that's been running. And in that one of the like, what are you afraid to feel, loneliness, you know, the mushrooms were like, oh, you want to see the other side, you want to see the connectedness and the allness, like, okay. Um and it being very overwhelming, and like that was definitely one of those moments of like, is it always going to be like this? I don't think I could function as a human like consistently in this state of consciousness. Like like, okay, give me back my individuality and my like forgetting that I'm one with everything all the time, if you want me to actually function as a human, right? Like and so visiting those places though, and visiting that place has been super important for me as somebody who has a lot of feels about the state of the world. And this is something too that we were talking about earlier, you know, and systemic structural messed upness, and oftentimes feeling like I don't belong in this world, because people act in ways that I just don't understand. I don't like I don't like, I can feel and I can sense the beauty and the innocence of humanity in a way that I see being exploited and trampled on, and it makes me feel like I don't belong here, like I don't belong on this earth. And it is through the experiences of being able to touch that presence of the divine or God, or put on God's eyes, that it's just like, oh, this isn't all there is for me. There is something else going on here, and If I can show up in my meat suit, as you say, which I use that term too, if I can show up in my meat suit as somebody who brings a little bit more of that beauty and innocence and compassion back into daily life, whether it's a little interaction on the bus or at the checkout line, to bring God's eyes back into this. I mean, that's one of the reasons that I keep on going back. Even in my most recent journey with Changa, like I was reminded of the God's eyes and God's eyes for myself, like compassion for myself, and them seeing the beauty of creation. And I want that for everybody. And I think that's like the common denominator for SGC, in that like our larger vision and mission statement talks about like everybody having access to an experience of the divine in this lifetime. And I like to add, in my cosmology, in this body, right? Because it's just like I get to experience like, oh my gosh, my molecules that contain carbon as I'm breathing, like were once the carbon of that plant sitting next to me, maybe. Like, there's this like very visceral oneness factor that non-ordinary states can really tune you into.
Love that. I want to go back to the atheism conversation and kind of like hardcore materialism. And it's an interesting interface between that segment and psychedelic religions, for sure. And I've been hearing the use of the term atheist lately, the last like 3-4 weeks. And I'm like, I don't know if we have the same definition around that term. So I'm like, it's a strange conundrum for me. And I don't know if listeners really are aware of what I'm even hinting at. Like, what did I just bring up for you there? I'm kind of curious.
Oh, well, because, especially in the times that we're living now, where people have seen so much destruction and domination as a result of organized religion, like, there's a way in which, like I feel like some people even identify as an atheist as a reaction formation against that. And when you actually start to talk to them, about their, like their cosmology, you'll find out they're actually an animist. Like, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like,
Right.
I think the definition of atheism, yeah, it's just like when somebody tells you they're an atheist, you like that doesn't necessarily mean what you think it means, or it's really helpful to actually dive a little, if you care, if you actually care to be like, can you tell me, like, well, what do you think about consciousness? Because I think that's also something, like, it's religion and spirituality and consciousness. And this is like so juicy in the psychedelic space, or the entheogenic space, right? I prefer actually that term. I'm using psychedelic now because everybody just does, but I really prefer the term entheogenic as well, because that's my experience, or what I am aiming for in my experiences. But there, like when you ask somebody about their religion, that's like one bucket. When you ask somebody about their spirituality, that could be a whole other bucket. And then when you ask somebody like their ideas about consciousness, oftentimes that's an entirely different bucket. And where we are now in like, non-ordinary state kind of science is like, and I love it. You're like, yeah, I know we need more conversation around like philosophers. Like we need neuroscientists who are like coming back to the like, oh, are our meat suits just receptors? Like, does consciousness actually exist like in the field all the time? And it's just by nature of the structure of our meat suit that we're able to perceive it. Consciousness isn't coming from our like chunky meat of brain in our skull, like, yeah. And I think similarly, like non-ordinary states can open those conversations up. And so when somebody says that they're an atheist, like it could mean so many things. It could just mean that they haven't actually thought about any of these things. It could mean that they're so traumatized by religion that they don't want to think about these things. Or it really could mean that, no, they have done a lot of thinking about these things and they are a hardcore materialist who thinks, that like when you die, kaput, and that it's all just like a completely, yeah, like molecules rearranging,
Mm-hmm.
and this is an accident.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And the critiques are often compelling from atheists. So like, it can't be like any god worth having wouldn't have this world. It's like, well, let's dig deeper. Let's have that conversation. But it's like, what is that, and what's driving that? And yeah, religious trauma is a big one. Sorrow in the face of the state of the world is a big one, and it's hard to grapple with. Totally. What I find interesting is simulation theory kind of popping off, and like all sorts of people who were hard materialists are now like, yeah, yeah, I guess in a simulation tarot is cool. Or like, whatever the conversation is. I find that interesting. I don't really know what to do with it, but yeah, I guess good enough. um, as long as they're hopefully working for people and planet.
Yeah. Well, and I think, like, I mean, now we're getting into like kind of deep theological questions around like, yeah, like, how could there be a God when this is our world? And I've certainly wrestled with that. Absolutely, positively. I mean, I think I wrestle with that on a daily basis practically these days. Um, and then it's like, well, could God be sad about this world too? Like, there's nothing inherent in the conception of like the divine or God, unless you get into free will, right? If like unless there's no free will, right? That like God could just be like, oh wow, this part of creation, like it is an experiment, and we don't know how it's going to go. And then you can get into Gaia theory, and like how that interfaces with conceptions of, like, is there divine or is there a God? And, the person who actually did Gaia theory, I think he would have identified as an atheist. And then like you look at something like Judy Grant's theory, like microbia, which is, that the microbes are hosting us, right? Like in this way, like the microbes are the most intelligent ones, and we're hosted by our ecosystems, which kind of throws our anthropomorphic anthropocentrism, like, all on its tail. Like, oh wow, really the only thing that allows us to use our meat suits with as much precision and like will that we execute over it are the colonies of microbes that we inhabit. It's like there's so many different ways of looking at it, and I think that's kind of like the awesome thing. And like for me, the word divine and the words God, at some point, become pluralistic by kind of existing. I'd say that there's as many flavors of God or the divine as there are souls on the planet. And whether that's by design, by like the God at the top of the mountaintop, and there's many paths to get there, or whether it's a pantheistic, like there are lots of kind of beings with way more like powers over matter and consciousness than us, kind of having fun with our material realm. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's part of the mystery. And whether we'll even know that after we die, who knows? But I'm like exploring that mystery, and having a sense of it, and even like dipping your toes into it. I think that's, for me, that's one of the most compelling reasons to continue to coming back to practices that engage non-ordinary states.
Great. I'm curious about SGC intenser on EPM for like kind of inclusion. Like it's in Oakland, right? It's like
Well,
pretty
actually,
diverse area.
the EPM kind of is more focused in Seattle. Like that's
Mm.
so our EPM team is comprised of we have a team, and it's actually mostly doctors. And two of those doctors are in Seattle. We did the first, or I should say, it would be like the second post like becoming an actual like church entity, like filing the papers in Facilitator Intensive in Seattle, really with the intention of ordaining facilitators up there who are able to work with the palliative care practice there, who's really super interested in referring folks. But I think your question was more around like equity of access, in terms of like how will people find us, or how will people like be able to like do it maybe financially or fiscally, or like is there
I'm more
other
curious
stuff?
about like how do we as religious organizations look of interest and able to be of service for minority populations, something like Black folks, Latino folks, things like that.
Yeah. And you know, I don't know that anybody has like super great answers to that right now. The answers that we have come up with the scope and capacity that we have now is that, no one turned away for lack of financial means. There is a donation, like, hey, if you can donate this much amount of money to cover the costs related to the liturgy, amazing. But if not, we have a directed donation fund for the EPM. We can often find people who will sponsor people through a particular liturgy. But in terms of, really making it accessible to populations, Latino populations, BIPOC populations, um, that is a really good question. And again, like, I think this is something that a guest recently said about like using your organization's resources to go where they are and engage and develop and build those relationships. That is something that we definitely like absolutely positively want to do, and at this point just don't have the capacity because of where we're at in our organizational growth. And even to the point of like, I would never want somebody who's in a vulnerable population to begin with to be like part of like the beta round, right? So there's like that the person who I talked to about the only person who's gone all the way through, like we were pretty straight up with them that like, this is, like we're really early in developing this liturgy. Like, do you have capacity to give us grace? And that person was super well supported, well resourced, like until we're super solid in the ways that the liturgy, we can like run through the liturgy and there's more than one like facilitator who's available to do the liturgy, and there's facilitators who look like those people able to do the liturgies. I don't know that kind of outreach and developing like sticky relationships with folks in those communities really makes sense. I've made some of those connections, and I have those cards, and I've had those conversations. Like, I hope you're still in the position that you're in 3 years when we're ready to reach out to you and say, hey, can we offer, like, how can we offer this a good way to your community? How, like, do you have people in your, like, one of the things that we're looking at in terms of even like within our congregation, serving BIPOC folks is actually having the people who are showing up who identify as such have self-determination in terms of like, is there somebody within their community that they want to go through the facilitator intensive and ordination process in order to be their facilitator, right? Like, and I think similarly in communities that perhaps already have a faith structure together, And whether that's through a church or like through looser means, but they already have some kind of affinity themselves, and they already have identified leadership in people who they trust within their community, that if we can train those people up in our liturgy, as opposed to trying to, those are like, oh, here's what we're doing. Are you interested in doing it in your community? We will make ourselves available to help you do that. But just coming in and saying like, this is the way you should do things. Because also I'm big into permaculture, and the idea that, one solution that's appropriate in one ecosystem might not be the appropriate solution in another. Right. And so like the way that we've developed the EPM liturgy might not even fit, for instance, like, a Black Baptist church who like has a small group of people who's super interested in pursuing this work and wants access to it. And yeah, but to make ourselves available for those kinds of conversations and like helping them adapt our liturgy to whatever is appropriate to them. I'm really excited about that happening in the future. Right now, we're like, okay, can we just like run through it a few more times completely and make sure that all the bugs are worked out? Yeah. Yeah, at this point where we don't even advertise it, right? Because we don't have capacity. We need more facilitators. Yeah.
Yeah, right on. So, as we're wrapping up, was there anything super important we wanted to try to include here? Make sure people knew about everything going on out there?
Yeah, I mean, I will say that Sacred Garden is we're doing another facilitation intensive. If folks are interested in what it could look like, and whether it's with Sacred Garden or like in other communities that are forming their own religious affirmative organizations, our next facilitation intensive is in Portland. If you go to sacredgarden.life, there and click on the workshops tab, you can find out more information about that. Those experiences they're not trainings. They don't you don't end up qualified to do anything you weren't before you got there. That's what our ordination and practicum is for. But if you're interested, in really learning about all these things that we're talking about. We didn't get into the health and safety stuff.
Let's do a quick blast on health and safety. I think that's important here. That was kind of like one of our biggest interests.
Yeah. I mean, in order to be cool under RIFRA, you need to make sure you're not diverting sacrament, and you need to make sure you're not hurting anybody. And because the sacraments of our church are powerful substances when they enter the human body, a lot of time and care needs to go into making sure you're not hurting anybody. And, I don't know how much you guys have covered the Soul Quest.
Only a little bit, but I heard some really weird stuff. Their paperwork was not very tight. Also, like not only were they operating a little fast and loose, their disclaimers and all that kind of stuff were a little wonky.
Right. And, I'm not in on the waiver conversations and the paperwork on that end. What I have done is I took the initial version of the health and safety questionnaire, and oh my gosh, myself and Beth, who is an retired ER doc, now a functional medicine doc. We spent probably 50 hours on, doing research on, because SGC is a multi-sacrament church. And so we have now three sacraments that are actually four. Yeah, because two just got, yeah. So we now have four sacraments with approved liturgies. And, initially it was two, and like, that's a lot. Like, that's like a lot of health and safety data. And so what happens is we do our best on the backstage to compile all of that. And then a person fills out their health and safety questionnaire. Right now, I'm the only person who's doing the intake interviews. So everybody, after they fill out the health and safety questionnaire, goes through an intake interview, partly to help assess things that don't really come out in a questionnaire all the time. Like a person could be like super questionnaire adverse and they're super sparse and you're like, this person feels kind of crazy, but then you meet them in person and you're like, oh, you're just a person who doesn't do well on forms. It happens. And the intake interview is also where we get one-on-one, like captive audience style interaction with somebody to talk about consent and how consent around touch works in our ceremonies, and how we handle consent, where the multiple points for different liturgies, they get to have conversations about consent, how I teach people a small exercise, embodied exercise, somatic exercise about tuning into oneself and figuring out where your own boundaries are for that day, and then coach people on how to communicate those to their facilitators and whoever they're sitting with, whether it's SGC or just their partner or friends, because that is so much like emotional safety and being able to like wear that, because then that does go into like physical health and safety too, because like, oh, we actually do want everybody to opt in to what we call safety touch, right? Like if if you're about to fall over and we can help keep you like upright and guide you to not step on other people or hurt other people, like, we have specific agreements about how that happens. And yeah. But then the intake interview is also where we get more information if there's things that people aren't comfortable talking about on the health and safety questionnaire on a form. Oftentimes it's clarification, it's just like, oh, like you mentioned this medication, but you didn't mention this health condition that's normally associated with that medication. Like, or is it off label, or do you actually have this other, so clarification. And then as a result of that intake interview, they get an intake note, and then they get a designation, either sacrament eligible or sacrament provisional. And if they're sacrament provisional, then what are the provisions? And it might be, around like, oh, this person has high blood pressure, and so, we need these measures to be taken before ceremony to keep them as safe as possible because of their high blood pressure. Or it could be like, oh, this person is really going through some big stuff in their life, and we want access to their therapist. We want them to be in therapy, and we want to be able to talk to their therapist, as part of like, clearance. But like, did the people who are caring for them outside of this, like, know that they're doing this, and are we all on the same page? Yeah. So, I mean, the sacrament provisions can be a lot of different things. And again, like that took hours and hours and hours upon hours. And there's still some things that come up as like, oh, this is a new situation. Okay, how are we going to deal with this? Yeah. And then so once somebody goes through the intake, they become a practitioner, they get a sacrament eligible or a sacrament provisional status, and then they start getting invited to ceremonies. When people register, facilitators are required to read their health and safety questionnaires and their intake notes, ideally before the prep call for that particular liturgy. And facilitators, to the best that we can, are trained to like, oh, if somebody shows up to the prep call and they're like, oh, by the way, my medication's changed. Okay, so now go to the liturgy and see if that like looks like something that we need to actually escalate back to the intake and health and safety team to make sure that they're still okay. And then facilitators are asked to like have those like availability for those consent check-ins, right? So they'll read on the health and safety questionnaire what the person kind of their initial like, oh, this is how I want my consent and touch to handle. But that's just a snapshot in time. And that's what we teach people too. Like what you wrote on that form could change. And so it's really super important for you to have a check-in with the facilitator to update that information depending on what information you get from your body sense check-in and your body scan on the day of ceremony or the week before ceremony. So that's like a snapshot.
I think you did it great for the speed. It was lovely. Cool. So, Livi, where can people find out more about your work, Sacred Garden Community, and EPM?
Yeah, so Sacred Garden Community, sacredgarden.life is the URL, and there's lots of information on there. Like I said, the EPM stuff we're not really advertising it so much. Like if people are really super interested in like pursuing that work as a facilitator, please by all means like go to our workshops tab and reach out to us in that way. If you are somebody who is seeking those services for yourself as a candidate, go to the website, get on our mailing list and just send a general message to the address I think it's info@sacredgarden.life. But we cannot guarantee, like we can only take one candidate at a time, work with one person at a time right now because of our capacity. And then if you want to know more about me personally or work with me personally, I still do some private practice work, like sitting with folks outside of the church as what feels awesome. LiviJoy.com, and that's about it.
Right on. Well, thank you so much, and I hope we can do it again. I can't wait to learn more.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for having me, Joe. This is like such like a like I just feel like so like warm and fuzzy to like grace the same airwaves as so many of like my like heroes and heroines and people who I really look up to in this space. So it's been an honor and a privilege. Thank you so much.